Okay, so hello, lovely people. It's really good to be with you here today. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Hello, and I'm Kerry. At this point, most people would list all their accolades, but frankly, well, I'm a hot mess. So I studied law and English literature and psychology. Sure, that's great, but I also contracted meningitis twice and encephalitis once. And I'm studying to be a neuroscientist, but that will sit alongside the other letters that I have after my name. To name a few: OCD, ADHD, CPTSD, FND. Well, luckily, I'm an Agile behavioural coach, so my work focuses on individuals and interactions. And then by helping myself, I also help other hot messes become less messy. And I've been using Agile ways of working for just under a decade, and I'm really passionate about what I do, despite having crippling anxiety about doing it. So although some elements of my physiological makeup don't quite so much, I still love business, books, and brains. We learn to work with what we have, right? So today, let's look at what we have. So we're going to be looking at stress, anxiety, and overwhelm. And then we're going to be looking at burnout, how stress, anxiety, and overwhelm lead to burnout, and how it can make conflict worse. We're going to look at where these responses came from, how the pandemic has made these things harder to deal with for us, for our colleagues, our teams, and our businesses. We're going to look at what we can do going forwards. To begin with, though, I'd like you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're in a dark forest. You're alone. Actually, you're lost. And there's silence all around you. And as you stand there, not knowing where you are or where to go, behind you hear a twig snap. Now, a moment later, your friends come through the bushes with torches. You're found and you're safe. So I wonder how you felt. If you open your eyes, tell me how you were feeling, or think about how you were feeling, both when you were lost and then when you realized that you were safe. So you, with just under 100 billion neurons and all of your rational thought, still had these responses. And just with a quick show of hands, I wonder who felt tense, who had an increased heart rate, who felt perhaps hyper-aware. And then perhaps the more anxious amongst you or more imaginative might have felt that a bit more intensely. So let's look at where these feelings come from, these responses come from. And to do that, we need to look at some of the earliest organisms. So here you can see some amphioxi. Now, a few 100 million years ago, they would sit anchored in the water. They're tiny aquatic worm-like creatures, and they would wait for food to drift into their mouths. They were really simple, so they didn't have a brain so much as a control center that would make them dart away from shadows to escape any kind of perceived threat. Now, as those ancient organisms evolved to become more complex, to have more complex movements, they needed to evolve a more complex control center to help them with those movements. And as our ancient ancestors developed better threat responses, those were the ones that survived. So the next generation inherited those traits, and those threat response systems were passed on down the ages. These responses are primal, not primitive, and certainly not reptilian. A more useful model of how our brain works comes from Dr. Dan Siegel, and it's called the brain in the hand. So it works like this. If you have your fingers closed over your thumb like this, the heel of your hand here, that forms your brainstem. It controls your breathing, your digestion, your heart rate, and so on. And your fingers here are your cortex. And the two fingers in the middle, that's your prefrontal cortex. That's the bit that houses and controls your executive function, your decision making, your ability to solve problems, your creativity. And the palm underneath the fingers here, that houses your limbic system. That's the bit that deals with your emotions, your motivation, your fight or flight responses. Now, this is you in a rational state when you're calm. But sometimes, as Dan Siegel calls it, you might flip your lid. Now, in the thumb here is the amygdala, and any kind of stress event will trigger a response from your amygdala. This is the bit of your brain that deals with your emotions, including your fear, anger, aggression, and anxiety. And it does this using the significance of events. It takes emotional memory and it predicts what an appropriate response to that threat ought to be. And the trouble is, it's a complete guess. It's going on what's happened to you before and in the eons before. It doesn't have a concept of our current context. So let's look at what happens in a bit more detail. Your sympathetic nervous system is triggered and you get a flood of chemicals released: adrenaline, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, and cortisol. So adrenaline gives you the need, makes you feel the need to move. The hormone cortisol, it's a suppressant, so it suppresses your immune system, your digestion, your libido, your ability to grow and repair. The neurotransmitter acetylcholine gives you a sense of urgency. So you will have felt this if you've ever been in a rush to get a plane, although who does that anymore? Perhaps the more relevant context right now would be trying to get to your next Zoom meeting before the last one's finished. And then the neurotransmitter norepinephrine gives you a sense of alertness. And when you were stood in the forest a moment ago, perhaps some of you would have had this sensation. It's important to note that these are involuntary neurobiological responses. They happen in our subconscious, and they happen in our subconscious because it costs our body less energy when things are subconscious. You an idea of the scale of your subconscious. If you were to take an A4 piece of paper and to draw a circle to represent your conscious, with the rest of the paper being your unconscious self, how big do you think that circle would be? The reality is that most of the piece of paper would be your subconscious, and if you took a Sharpie and drew a small dot, that dot would represent your conscious self. We can see from this that a lot of the behavior that we see, particularly when we're in stressful situations, it's reflexive, not intentional. Now, you might interpret what's happening here as a simple case of stimulus and response. But actually, your state becomes an intervening variable. So that means whatever the stimulus is, plus your current physical state, mental state, whether you're tired or hungry or scared because there's an international pandemic, those things together are what inform your response. One such intervening state might be stress. Stress is a reciprocal physiological response. That means your state affects the response, which in turn affects the state, in turn affects your response, and so on. So stress, you could say, is kind of nuts. Now, when we're under stress, we feel what we feel because we believe, or we might believe, that our situation is new or previously not something that we've experienced. We might think that the outcome is uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen on a daily basis or a moment by moment basis. We might think that the outcome might be harmful. In some way, it might challenge our well-being, and perhaps we won't be able to overcome that threat. And we might think that we have limited power or no power to change the outcome. The process is both chemical and interpretive. So we, in the form of our amygdala, we decide how to respond in the moment. And we experience this on a daily basis when we're going for a one-to-one or an appraisal, if we have to go into an uncomfortable retrospective, if we need to give someone feedback, or if we take up a public speaking engagement. We respond to these situations as if we're about to be chased, or as if we are being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, or, zombies. So, another intervening state might be anxiety. And this is where we have an acute awareness of the risks. And this response is great for simple tasks. If we want to move or run or lift or throw, or in my case, what it evokes is panic cleaning. But it's not so great for complex tasks because it diverts energy away from our cortex. And it can become a constant battle, especially because for a lot of people, things are really hard right now. And it can lead to a sense of overwhelm. And this is not our fight or flight response. This is where we become hyper aware and we move into the freeze response. We don't think we can overcome the threat. Things have gotten so far beyond our control that there's no point. And these responses are meant to be short-term solutions to short-term dangers to help us escape immediate threat. But the trouble is, we experience them day in, day out, and sometimes several times a day. And what this then can lead to is burnout. And that's what happens when the reward that we get no longer offsets the effort. The problem is it can result in scarring and aging in the areas of our brains that regulate and process our emotions. That means we end up with less control over our emotions, particularly over our negative emotions when we're experiencing burnout. We're more prone, more sensitive to startling. It also affects our memory. We struggle to remember things. We become less creative. We find it difficult to solve simple problems, let alone complex ones, and we struggle to pay attention. Essentially, what we're left with is a burned stress response system. So let's do a quick experiment. How's her mood? So if you get your smart device and kindly go to menti.com, and at menti.com, if you enter the code 4303232, and I want you to tell me how you think she's feeling. What's her mood? That's really interesting. Okay, so a lot of people are thinking she's quite neutral. That's really good. But a few people are interpreting her as having a negative, unhappy, feeling sad, or perhaps even feeling grumpy or cross. Okay, thanks for participating. So what's interesting about this is that normally we use our interpretation of vocal tone, facial expressions, and body language to show us how safe we are with other people. But we usually get it wrong. There's no one face for each emotion, so our brain has to guess how we're feeling based on context. And the trouble is that when we're experiencing burnout, it gives us a more negative interpretation of what we see. So we might see our happy face as neutral. We might see a neutral face as sad or grumpy. And we might see a sad or grumpy face as really angry. So for anybody there who thought she was angry, I wonder, how stressed are you? It might be time to step back and take things a little easier wherever you can. And she's actually a metahuman. So for those of you who thought she had a neutral face, good spot. She's actually an AI creation. But what's interesting is that we still interpret what we see. And the problem is that when we're online, when we're on Zoom calls or your online video provider, there's even less context for us to judge where we are. And that leads to more drama. Now, it was estimated, actually some research showed that before the pandemic, we would spend on average 2.5 hours every day, every single one of us, involved in some sort of drama, in the form of judging or venting, blaming and shaming, maybe feeling anger and frustration or resentment, perhaps sabotaging or engaged in meaningless politics, maybe arguing about accountability or not taking responsibility. Now, underneath everything, most of us want to be seen as a good person. If we are a good parent or a good employee or a good friend, we can be seen as a good person. We can believe that we're a good person. And that means that we're more likely to be validated, to feel accepted. And that means we have more chance of staying safe, of staying alive. Now, when we were looking at the formation of the brain earlier, our ancient ancestors were more likely to survive if they were in social groups. And the more socialized amongst them were the ones that survived. And again, they pass these traits down. And so we take rejection very seriously. And what can sometimes happen, particularly with this kind of drama, is that we see what's called othering, where we move into a state of us versus them. We see ourselves as being in the in-group and them as being in the out-group. And the problem is that this stops the area of our brain that's related to compassion from functioning effectively. We can't feel compassion for people in the out-group. So we fall into traps. We dehumanize the other group or the other person. We treat them with contempt. And that can be something as small as tutting or eye-rolling. The trouble with those things is that they fall into what are called the 4 toxins of communication. So the 4 toxins: stonewalling, where we simply ignore people; contempt, where we treat people as if they're beneath us; blame and criticism, where we pin the blame and we say it's all your fault; defensiveness, it wasn't me. And the trouble is, when we're falling into these traps, if we feel attacked, then we see questions or feedback as criticism. And we respond in kind. We respond with denial or indignation or deflection, blame in the form of finger pointing, and shaming. And the problem with this is it makes both people involved feel rejected, and thus we feel unsafe. Now, an interesting thing about criticism is that when I make a mistake, I might see my mistakes as coming as down to my circumstances, whereas I see your mistakes as an inherent character flaw. So I make mistakes because of what happened to me, and you make mistakes because of who you are. And we respond to people and to their mistakes as if that were the case. And we don't understand why people aren't responding to us as if that was the case. These are snap judgments. We all do this. And we've seen before, from the brain in the hand model, we lose access to rational thought when we flip our lid. We've also seen that our body has an involuntary chemical response to stress, and that changes our behavior. We've had a look at stress, anxiety, and overwhelm. We've looked at burnout, how we reach those states, how they can affect our ability to regulate emotions. We've looked at how we interpret facial expression more negatively when we're under stress. And we've looked at framing things as us versus them. We've looked at how that leads to contempt, dehumanizing, and allows us to treat others as culpable. So what can we take from all of this? Well, we can understand that the problem is not reality. The problem is how we see reality. And how we see reality affects how we see everything. and it informs our response. Now, luckily, we stay neuroplastic until the day we die, until we're dead, or if you prefer, undead. And the good thing is that we are shaped by every single event and interaction that we experience, which means we can do better. So take a moment right now, notice your mood. How are you feeling? How calm are you? How pleasant or not is this experience right now? Next, you can respond to the rush of chemicals that you might be experiencing. So if you're feeling that you're under the influence of adrenaline, then you can respond to that. Give your body the message that you're responding to the threat by moving, run, jump. I did this earlier today. I was quite anxious. I ran up and down the stairs. By the time I got halfway up the stairs, I was laughing because it works. You're experiencing cortisol. Cortisol is actually one of the easiest things to deal with. So if you're in a stressful situation or something is threatening you, it takes around 90 seconds for cortisol to subside from your system. So you can help distract yourself with some simple breathing exercises in the meantime. Now, some of you will have seen the square breathing exercises, and that exercise is great for maintaining your current level, stress level, or your current level of mood. A more effective one in the face of stress is 2 short breaths in and then a longer breath out. And this is the kind of breath that we see when we're laughing or crying or singing. If you're experiencing acetylcholine and a sense of urgency, then you can do something about this. You can plan out 3 next steps that might help you to deal with this situation. Or if that is too much, then just the next right thing. And if you're experiencing norepinephrine, if you're feeling hyper aware, particularly alert, then take a moment to notice reality. Ask yourself, what do I know for sure? What am I assuming? What story am I telling myself? What am I allowing myself to believe? We could term this as practical pessimism. That's where we're noticing and accepting our situation. We don't need to waste energy fighting it because there's nothing necessarily that we can do to change it, but instead we can decide what we're going to do next. We could also use realistic optimism, where we plan ahead for obstacles, even whilst assuming that things will work out for the best. And what we're trying to do is move to the real, instead of looking at the fantasy or the ideal. And we must do this because we might want stability, but disruption and change are normal. So this turns out to be a biopsychosocial problem. That's to say, we have a physical response to an environmental trigger, and then our brain interprets that when we experience thoughts and assumptions, and we make decisions on the basis of that. But it's also affected by how connected we feel. Relationships stimulate learning and growth. And so if we can get ourselves to a position of self-regulation, we can move from there to a position of co-regulation. How do we do that? Well, we use cues. Cues like helping people to feel that they're safe. We give the message, you're safe, I've got your back, and you've got mine. I care because you have value. We can show gratitude, show genuine appreciation for small things that people do for us, with us, around us on a day-to-day basis. We can pay it forward, be generous without resentment, generous with our time, generous with our help, generous with our information. And we can compliment people behind their backs. Eventually, if it does get back to them, it's a huge emotional boost for that person. We can also celebrate tacos. Okay. Tiny accomplishments and successes. Tacos. Okay. Let's try something. I want you to turn to someone you don't know and for 1 minute, very briefly introduce yourself. Now, I can't hear you, and so there's a timer that's going to be on the next slide, and that'll tell you when you're done. And then you can swap, and the other person can introduce yourself. So turn to someone you don't know and very briefly introduce yourself. Okay. Ooh. Time to swap. Okay. So I wonder how many of you, whilst you were talking to each other there, told each other your name, the company you work for, and your job title. So if you did that, what you've just used is the military code of honor for captured prisoners of war, where you give over your name, your rank, and your service number. So I want you then to take a moment, close your eyes, and for a moment, notice your state. How are you feeling? What have you been thinking about today? What's worrying you? What's important to you right now? So keep those thoughts in mind and then introduce yourself to the same person again. I'll give you a minute each again. Okay, so swap. So I imagine that was a completely different experience, right? It's amazing what changes when we can share a bit more information than just the basics. Okay, so another exercise that I encourage teams to try, which shows cues of safety and helps to encourage feelings of safety, and it also supports and gives people the opportunity to show each other gratitude. And it's so thinking about the last exercise, if you have a pen and paper with you, write down 3 to 5 things that are currently worrying you. I'll give you a moment to do that. Okay, so next, normally I would ask people to add what they've written down to one of 3 columns. So to put what they've written down into either things that I can change, to write them down in the column that I can change with help, or to write them down in the column where I can't change them. But today we're going to focus on the middle column, things that I can change with help. So choose those worries or those concerns. And with those concerns in mind, get specific. Ask yourself, who can help me with this? How can they help me with this? And when might they be able to help me? When can I ask them? I use this with teams where there's low safety. For example, maybe the daily stand-up or the daily scrum isn't a safe place to say what's actually going on. Maybe when it's treated as a carrot and stick progress report. But by having a wall or a place where people can put a note up saying what they need help with, and then they can see anything that they themselves can help with, and people who can help them can put their names next to their own stickies, then they have the opportunity then to talk to each other privately, away from gaze, away from places where they feel perhaps unsafe. So another thing that we can do is to look at feedback. And instead of the poop sandwich method of feedback, which really doesn't work, by the way, we can use something called, which I like to call Kintsugi feedback. So this is where we move away from blaming and finger pointing and shaming and criticism. These are only going to evoke defensiveness, and particularly if we're under stress, we're more susceptible to give those responses, even if the feedback that we're receiving isn't that critical. So instead, we can look at the behaviors or the actions that we want to see more of in the other person. So we make that our focus. We look at what we want to encourage. the behaviors that we want to see more of, the things that are working. And if things are a bit broken, then we focus on how we can put things back together better. The idea here is to feed what you want to grow and to try to stay neutral to the rest. And when we're doing this, we can take a position of vulnerable and honest coaching, not seeing ourselves as superior, but actually as somebody who cares about the other person and wants to help them learn and grow. We see the beauty in the broken. And as we're talking to these people, talking to people who might feel criticized, we can show our own vulnerability. Maybe we'll go into the conversation sharing our feelings. I'm feeling nervous about bringing this to you because I don't want you to take this the wrong way. I don't want you to feel that I'm criticizing you. I want to look at what's happened. I might share that I'm feeling anxious in the moment. Perhaps I might tell them that that my need for safety or my need for certainty isn't being met. So talking about my needs, and this concept comes from Marshall Goldsmith and his book Nonviolent Communication. And as I'm talking to somebody and giving them feedback, I can make sure that I'm showing them empathy, not sympathy. So with sympathy, my bias meets yours. You feel that you're the victim, and I agree. And the hidden message that I'm sending is, I agree that you can't do hard things. With empathy, though, we take a different approach. We say, that sounds really hard. What are you going to do about that? So again, we're reframing the ideal to the real. Now, it's unlikely we're ever going to get to a position where we trust each other 100%. This is business after all. But we can move to a position where we can at least trust each other enough to be able to disclose our mistrust. When we look at our culture, we want to move to a position where we're creating a safe environment, where we're less suspicious of each other and more suspicious of our own certainty. And from there, we can move from self-regulation to co-regulation. Because we need connection. We only get through these things together. And as Dave Snowden said, every corpse on Everest was an extremely motivated person. Without a support system, the individual will fail. So today we've looked at our brains and what goes on when we're experiencing stress, when we're experiencing anxiety, when we feel that somehow we're under threat, whether that be from things going on in work or whether that be from things that are going on in our life outside of work. We have the same responses to both, and both impact on each other. We've also looked at how we sometimes react and what we're aiming for when we do have those reactions, what we're striving to be seen as, how we want to see ourselves. And we've seen that the thing that impacts all of this is how we view the world, and how we view the world in turn impacts everything else. We've also looked at some things that might help and some things that don't. We've seen that this is not a simple one-sided issue. It's a complex, multifaceted situation. In essence, it's a biopsychosocial problem, and that needs a biopsychosocial response. Now, it may well be that I've confirmed what you already knew, but as we all know, common sense does not necessarily lead to action. Simple doesn't mean easy. But what we can bear in mind throughout everything is that hard does not mean impossible. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry. Could you stop sharing slides so we can see you? Hello.
Hi.
Yes, hi. Oh, wow. And you can see us too. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Rosie, do you have any questions on the app? Set them to the Slack. Okay. Then I should pay attention to the Slack. Sorry. So if you've not seen it, track remote in Slack. There's where the questions are. Okay, Kerry, what advice do you have for considering anxiety when managing agile teams?
I think the first thing to do is to be mindful of how people in the room are feeling. If we go in and display things and what to do and how to do it, then we're likely to trigger that fight or flight response. We're likely to trigger their defensiveness. A really good way to start is to ask people how they're feeling before you go into a conversation with them, to build up some basic levels of trust and some basic empathy, hearing what they're going through, and listening through that without giving them advice in the first instance. Without telling them your observation of what they're going through, but showing them some empathy and saying that sounds really hard. And that can help to dispel some of the anxiety that they might be feeling, that their job might be at risk, or that, in some way there's some other danger that you don't know about. And then from there, you can have a more real conversation there when you're more willing to trust each other.
Great. Okay. And as we return to in-person working or hybrid working, how can we reduce burnout and stress when we make this change?
Absolutely. I think a really crucial point to begin with is to notice it before it happens. If your team is pulling all-nighters regularly to meet targets, then they're not going to last well. If people are juggling a lot of different pressures alongside work, and that's coming through in the way that they're starting to speak to people, then it might be time to have a conversation about how you can manage that workload more effectively. So when people show up with anxiety that's leading to burnout, they might become more snappy. They might have less enjoyment in their work. They might be one of those people who previously would get things done, and now they're in a position where they'll say they'll get it done, or they'll say when they think they're going to do it, but actually the work doesn't show up. So these we don't need to chastise people for this, but these are warning signs, something that tells us that we might need to slow down and step back a little, and speak to leadership about how we can help to mitigate the workload.
Right. Okay, and then there's a couple of requests to put stuff into Slack afterwards if you have the time. Somebody has asked, can you put the details of breathing exercises to lower your cortisol responses into Slack?
Yeah.
And someone has also said, can you share any links or further reading about techniques for giving better feedback?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll just say I'd recommend a couple of books if you want to be giving people feedback. So there's Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Goldsmith, and there's also Crucial Conversations, and the name of the author has just slipped out of my brain. I have a final slide where I've pictured some recommended reading, but I'll pop that in the Slack channel for sure.
I'm just frantically searching. Crucial Conversations was Kerry Patterson. Is that what I'm thinking of? Yeah. Okay, so if you shared those questions with us, if you're looking for that feedback from links from Kerry, they'll appear in the Track Remote Slack channel today or tomorrow. Can we have one more round of applause, please, for Kerry? Thank you very much, Kerry.
Thank you so much.